Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The event we're analyzing today is Johannes Gutenberg inventing the movable type printing press and how it revolutionized the world. Gutenberg created a transformation in knowledge acquisition and communication. This kicked off the first information age. The printing press had a bigger effect on the world than the computer or the internet. In 1620, the English philosopher Francis Bacon wrote, "We should note the force, effect, and consequences of inventions, which are nowhere more conspicuous than those three which were unknown to the ancients, namely, printing, gunpowder, and the compass. For these three have changed the appearance and state of the whole world." By the way, 1620 was a significant year. That was the year the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts. In April 1900, the famed American author Mark Twain sent a letter to the opening of a Gutenberg museum in Mainz, Germany. Here's the best part of that letter. "Whatever the world is today, good and bad together, that is what Gutenberg's invention has made it, for from that source it has all come." Johannes Gutenberg is one of the most influential people in history. Whenever we're talking about an invention or a discovery, some will downplay the significance of the individual who created the change. They say, if they didn't invent it, somebody else would have. That's true, but only to a point. First of all, you could say that about any invention, discovery, or new idea. If not for the Wright brothers, somebody would have invented heavier-than-air flying machines. If not for Christopher Columbus, somebody would have shown Europeans how to reach the Western Hemisphere. If Newton hadn't developed his laws on gravity, or Einstein his theory of relativity, or Copernicus his heliocentric theory that the sun, not the earth, is at the center of the solar system, somebody eventually would have figured these things out. Yes, probably, but when? And would the delays have affected the development of humankind? If these things had been developed years later, or in different locations, the world might have developed differently. Although I've heard it pronounced a few different ways, I usually hear his name pronounced Johannes Gutenberg. So who was this guy? We actually don't know much about him as a person. We don't know what he looked like. There were no portraits made of Gutenberg while he was alive. It's kind of like Christopher Columbus. You see a lot of paintings or statues of Columbus or Gutenberg, but they were all made long after they died, so we have no idea what either man really looked like. We're not sure, but we don't think that Gutenberg ever married or had any kids. We don't even know when Gutenberg was born. It's estimated as somewhere around the year 1400 in Mainz. That was a city in the loose confederation known as the Holy Roman Empire. In case you're not familiar with that entity, the Holy Roman Empire was a political entity in Central Europe that lasted for around 1,000 years. It was made up of principalities, duchies, kingdoms, and free cities. It had nothing to do with ancient Rome. The Holy Roman Empire included the area which later became Germany. Fun fact, Germany is actually a very young country, younger than the United States. The U.S. dates its birth as July 4, 1776, but in the mid-1800s, there were a collection of independent German states. Otto von Bismarck was the one who unified them into a single country. After Prussia defeated France, Bismarck declared the formation of the new German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles on January 18, 1871. Declaring the formation of your new empire in the most famous place in your enemy's country, Bismarck knew how to stick it to France. Even though it was not a united country in the 1400s, Historians generally refer to this area of German-speaking entities as Germany, and I will do so in this episode. We believe that Gutenberg moved around a bit and lived in some other Germanic cities, but eventually he returned to Mainz, and that is where he developed his printing press, somewhere around 1440. We do not know exactly what Gutenberg was doing for a living in his early life. He was certainly learning skilled crafts like metalworking because he was able to put that knowledge to work when he invented his printing press system. We do know when he died. Gutenberg died in Mainz on February 3, 1468, somewhere around 70 years old. Most of the information we have on this great inventor came from lawsuits between Gutenberg and his partners or lenders regarding the printing press. The first printing occurred in ancient China. They would chisel an entire page of text into a wood block. The Chinese would apply ink onto the wood block and then print the text onto a surface. And before we go any further, whenever any printers in China, Europe, or anywhere carved characters into wood or other materials, they were always carved backwards, or a mirror image, so they would create a proper word or picture in the final print. So when you looked at the carved letter or word, it would appear backwards. This was necessary so when the ink touched the paper, or whatever material they were printing on, the letter or word would appear flipped and in the proper format. What did Johannes Gutenberg actually invent in Mainz, Germany around the year 1440? It was an integrated system for printing involving several features. Number one, movable type. What do we mean by that? Instead of carving an entire page of text into wood or some other surface, Gutenberg used reusable individual characters that could be arranged to form words and lines of text for printing. And by characters, we mean letters, numbers, and punctuation. He would put the individual characters into lines in wood frames to create words and spaces between the words along with punctuation. He also had spacers, so he would have blank spaces between the words so they would look like an actual sentence. Each line would be contained in a frame known as a chase or a form. He would then set out the characters in the next line and then the next line and so forth. This is how he created sentences and paragraphs. Johannes Gutenberg did not invent movable type, but he invented the first practical system which could mass produce books. Movable type had been invented in China, but there were many problems with the Chinese process. The Chinese system of writing does not use a small alphabet like European languages. Most of the European languages use the Latin alphabet with 26 letters, essentially the alphabet that came down from the ancient Romans. Although some European languages add accents, umlauts, cedillas, and tildes onto some of the letters. To create a full set of movable type characters in English, you just need 52 letters to cover capitals and lowercase letters, 10 numerals, and some punctuation like periods, commas, question marks, etc., along with spacers for between the words. Of course, to be practical, you would need many copies of each letter or numeral or punctuation to spell out entire words. You would certainly need a lot more copies of the vowels as compared to some of the consonants that are scarce in European languages, like Q or X. But written Chinese uses thousands of characters. For that reason, Chinese printers often found it was easier to use a single wood block carving with all of the words for that particular page than to use movable type. The Chinese used different materials, but mostly clay for their movable type, which was very fragile. Gutenberg used metal for his movable type pieces. Specifically, He used an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony, which made his movable type pieces very durable. The metal movable type could be used over and over and over. And for casting his individual metal characters, Gutenberg used reusable molds. By reusing the same molds to make the same metal type pieces, he could make the same exact letters, numbers, and punctuation over and over. His movable type was consistent. The number 2 innovation of Gutenberg, oil-based ink. Ink was not invented by Gutenberg. However, he is credited with developing a specialized oil-based ink. This oil-based ink worked much better with less smudges than the water-based ink used in China. Gutenberg would apply this oil-based ink using ink balls or dabbers. They were leather-covered balls with handles. He would coat the leather ink balls with the ink and then dab the ink onto the metal movable type characters. The number 3 innovation of Gutenberg, the screw press. Merriam-Webster defines a screw press as a press having a ram that is forced downward by the turning of a spindle with a steep pitched thread. By the way, the use of the screw press is why it's called a printing press. Gutenberg did not invent the screw press. He modified the type that was used in agriculture for making wine and olive oil. The Gutenberg screw press was made out of wood. It started with the wooden frame which held all the pieces together. Above was a very large threaded wooden screw. It had a long handle called a bar, which the operator would pull sideways. This would turn the screw downwards. The screw pressed downward onto a flat padded surface called a platen. The platen pressed a sheet of paper against the inked movable type. This was how he created a printed sheet of text. By integrating the system using metal movable type, oil-based ink, and the screw press, Gutenberg developed a system for mass production of printed text. Sadly, there are no existing Gutenberg printing presses today. We don't even have any original diagrams of a Gutenberg printing press. We have the general idea of a Gutenberg printing press system, mostly based upon the court records from some of the lawsuits he was involved in regarding his printing press. The Gutenberg press would usually be used to print a certain number of books at a time. This was called a print run. Theoretically, he could have set his movable type into the frames for each individual page and then saved them. Maybe that would have been practical for a short pamphlet, but not a long book such as the Bible, which was his first major project. The Gutenberg Bible had over 1,200 pages. For one thing, the storage required to have all of those frames of movable type set in place for each page would have been impractical. But the main problem was the number of individual characters of movable type that would be required. According to wordcounter.net, there are 3,116,480 individual characters, meaning letters, numbers, and punctuation, in the King James Version of the Bible. We don't know how many individual characters of movable type Gutenberg had, but it certainly was not over 3.1 million. For this reason, Gutenberg and the other printers of his time would decide how many copies they were going to make of a particular book in that print run. If he was planning on making 200 copies, he would print out 200 copies of page 1. Then he would rearrange his movable type and print out 200 copies of page 2. He would continue this process page by page until he was done. This meant that once he had sold out every copy of a particular print run or edition, he would have to start from scratch if he wanted to make additional copies. Now it's time to discuss why the Gutenberg printing press was such a big deal. Before Gutenberg, books were extremely expensive. Why? Because they took so long to make. Here's how the Romans made books. They were handwritten. Originally, they were on long scrolls, like you see in the movies. And by scrolls, I mean a long piece of parchment or papyrus wrapped around a wooden rod, which made the scroll easier to read and kept the scroll in better condition. Slowly, the Romans started using the codex system. A codex, or the plural, codices, were written on parchment, meaning the skin of a sheep or goat. Although in ancient times, sometimes papyrus or vellum was used instead of parchment. Vellum was a different kind of prepared animal skin from calves, lambs, or kid goats. Papyrus was the writing material made out of the plants from the Nile River Valley. Anyway, these pieces of parchment or papyrus were bound together along one edge. That simply means individual pages connected with the spine like a modern book. And these codices were usually protected by covers like a modern book cover. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the making of books did not improve much. The use of paper really helped. Paper was invented in China over 2,000 years ago. Paper was introduced to Europe somewhere around the 11th or 12th centuries. Paper was lighter, cheaper, and easier to produce than the previous writing materials. Before Gutenberg, books were still prepared by trained people called scribes. Their job was to hand copy documents and books. It took a long time. To copy one edition of the Bible took well over a year. Gutenberg printed 180 copies of the Bible in 3 to 5 years. That means he made 180 copies of the Bible in the same time it would have taken scribes to handwrite 3 or 4 copies. According to the United States Library of Congress, approximately 180 copies of the Gutenberg Bible were printed and first made available in about 1455. Of these, 145 were done on paper. The remaining 35 were printed on vellum, treated calfskin. 49 Bibles survived into the 20th century, and only 21 of these are complete. Of the 35 vellum copies, only 3 exist as complete copies. The library's copy is one of those 3. The others are in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and the British Library, London. There were books other than the Bible being prepared before Gutenberg, but since it took so long to copy a book, they were very expensive. This is why only the very wealthy and the church owned books. With Gutenberg's printing press allowing publishers to print hundreds of copies of a book in the same time it used to take to hand copy one book, the prices of books were greatly reduced. This meant a lot more people could afford books. Because of the movable type printing press, books became much more accurate. When people were copying books by hand, they had to write down every single letter and word. It was certainly easy to make a mistake. Now, I know what you're thinking. Somebody can make a mistake when they are setting their movable type to print a book. That is true. However, when a handwritten book contained a mistake, only one person or maybe a handful of people would read that particular book. When there is a mistake in a book produced from a printing press, hundreds, thousands, or in modern times, millions of people are going to read that book. It is much more likely that at least one of those readers will catch that mistake and notify the publisher. And then it is easy to correct the misprint. So although initial mistakes have not been eliminated, continuing errors have been greatly reduced. Canadian philosopher and media theorist Marshall McLuhan famously said, "The medium is the message." What did he mean by that? He was saying that the characteristics of a communication technology itself can have a more significant impact on society than the content it carries. That applies to print media, which became so much more widespread thanks to Johannes Gutenberg. Reading printed text does not cause linear thinking, but it requires and reinforces a sequential, linear process of thought. The fixed, sequential layout of printed text promotes a more focused and linear experience than video or audio. The printing press also helped standardize grammar, spelling, and punctuation. Before books and other printed texts were common, people were not concerning themselves with spelling or punctuation, and usually not thinking too much about grammar. The mass production of books, pamphlets, and other texts created consistent linguistic conventions. Instead of spoken language, written text required an explicit and constant system of spelling as well as punctuation to show grammatical relationships between words and sentences. This standardization was formalized with dictionaries and grammar books. The popularity of printed texts also created standard dialects of languages. In England, most publishing occurred in London, so the English language utilized in and around London became the default standard for the English language. A famous example of all this involved Dante Alighieri. Although he was so famous, he's usually just known by his first name. You might have heard of his most famous work, the Divine Comedy. That is actually considered a poem which consisted of 3 parts or books. The most widely known is the first part about hell, usually just referred to as Dante's Inferno. The second part was called Purgatory, and the third and final one was Paradise or Heaven. Dante Alighieri is often referred to as the father of the Italian language. That's because he did not write the Divine Comedy in Latin, which was customary at the time. Instead, he wrote in his native Tuscan dialect of Italian, since he was from Florence. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy the century before Gutenberg invented his printing press. However, Gutenberg's invention meant that the Divine Comedy was widely accessible and very popular throughout what is now Italy. Dante's works were read throughout the Italian peninsula. This is one of the main reasons the Tuscan dialect, centered in Florence, became the standard for the Italian language when Italy was finally unified as a country in 1861. And now, let's talk about some of the incredible ways that Gutenberg's printing press affected historical events. On October 31, 1517, Martin Luther famously nailed to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany, his 95 Theses. As I explained earlier, the various and separate Germanic states did not unite into a single country until 1871, but it just makes it easier to say Germany. With the help of the printing press, Martin Luther launched the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was a religious, political, and cultural movement in the 1500s in Europe which split Western Christendom into 2 contrasting camps, Catholics and Protestants. Up until the time Martin Luther launched the Protestant Reformation, most of Europe was under the control of the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church dominated in Greece, the Balkans, and Russia. In most of Europe, the Pope was sometimes more powerful than kings. So what did the printing press have to do with the Protestant Reformation? Martin Luther was not the first person to protest against the policies of the Roman Catholic Church. Reformers such as John Wycliffe in the 1300s and Jan Hus in the early 1400s had presented a lot of the points that Martin Luther did. The difference was Luther presented his objections after Gutenberg had invented his printing press. Without the printing press, only a few literate scholars would have been discussing Martin Luther's criticisms of the Roman Catholic Church. Thanks to Gutenberg's invention, Martin Luther's 95 Theses were widely distributed as a best-selling pamphlet within a year of when he posted those propositions on the door of the church in Wittenberg. Between 1517 and 1525, over 500,000 copies of Martin Luther's writings were published. This is what caused Luther's theories to take hold and have large percentages of Europeans join the Protestant movement. This major division of European Christianity led to a series of conflicts known as the European Wars of Religion. Some of the biggest ones of those were, number one, the 80 Years' War from 1568 to 1648. This wasn't entirely based on religion. It was mostly driven by the Dutch desire for independence from Spain. But part of the drive for political independence was the fact that the Dutch had become predominantly Protestant. Spain was strictly Catholic, and the monarchy of Spain would not tolerate anything other than Catholicism. This was during the time of the infamous Spanish Inquisition. Number two, the Anglo-Spanish War from 1585 to 1604. Although there were commercial reasons for the tensions between England and Spain, a main cause of this war was religious differences between Protestant England and the very Catholic Spain. You might not be familiar with this war, but you might have heard the term the Spanish Armada. That was when King Philip II of Spain sent an enormous naval fleet to invade England. In 1588, Philip wanted to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I and restore Catholicism in England. The short story of the Spanish Armada is the English, with the help of some crazy weather, soundly defeated the Spanish fleet and no invasion occurred. Number three, the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. This was actually a series of interconnected conflicts rather than one continuous war. It started out as a religious conflict within the Holy Roman Empire that I described earlier, and gradually spread to most of Europe and was fought for reasons other than religion. Without getting too sidetracked, the 30 Years' War started with the defenestration of Prague on May 23, 1618. That was when Protestant activists threw 3 Catholic officials out of a window at Prague Castle. Okay, I have several thoughts about this issue. Number one, surprisingly, this incident I just described in 1618, which started the 30 Years' War, is called the third defenestration of Prague. There had been 2 other such incidents where people were thrown out of windows in Prague in 1419 and 1485. How crazy is it that there were 3 times that people got thrown out of windows in Prague? Number 2, the verb defenestrate and the noun defenestration arose from these incidents in Prague. Apparently, the term may have originated in French before these incidents, but the defenestrations of Prague made these terms part of the English language. Number 3, I find it amazing that we have a verb to describe throwing somebody out of a window. We don't have verbs for every particular action. As far as I'm aware, there is no particular verb which specifically deals with throwing somebody off of a cliff. But in English, we have a specific verb, defenestrate, to describe the action of throwing somebody out of a window. Number 4, one final point. If I was an official in Prague in those days, I would have avoided this by making sure that my offices were always on the first floor. This way, if you get thrown out of the window, it's not such a big deal. Okay, back to the subject of today's episode. Another major result of the Catholic versus Protestant divide in Europe was the creation of the English colonies, which became the United States. And I can just hear the people in Virginia, including some of my cousins, yelling at me that the reason for the Jamestown settlement was not religion. And that is true. But the Puritans who founded New England certainly came to America because of religious differences. So it wasn't the only reason, but religion was one of the primary motivations for the foundation of the English colonies, which eventually became the United States. Gutenberg's printing press led to a great increase in literacy. Until fairly recently in history, we did not have any accurate statistics on the literacy rate throughout the world or even in a particular country. However, I think just about all historians agree that Gutenberg's invention helped increase the percentage of people that could read as books and other print media became more and more common. One source I found showed that the Netherlands probably had the highest literacy rate at the time Gutenberg invented his printing press around 1440, with approximately 17% of the population being able to read. 200 years later, the proportion of Dutch who were literate had climbed to around or over 50%. By the mid-1700s, approximately 85% of the Dutch population could read. That was an incredible growth rate, and it's largely attributable to the printing press. Gutenberg's printing press fueled the scientific revolution. For centuries, science was a very solitary pursuit. There were brilliant people who were mostly working alone or with a few close associates. With books becoming popular, scientists could share their findings on a broad basis. Having a large number of people reading about a person's scientific breakthroughs was important for so many reasons. Number one, it allowed other people to fact-check the purported findings. Maybe the original scientist was right, or maybe there were some flaws in their calculations or experiments. Number two, it created an accurate and accessible record of the findings. This meant that other people could use those exact findings, such as formulas, measurements, calculations, whatever. This allowed additional people to build upon the discoveries of others. Isaac Newton certainly felt that way. There's a famous quote of his from a letter to Robert Hooke in February 1676 when he said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." The printing press had a profound effect on the Renaissance. There is no single event that marks the beginning of the Renaissance. It essentially arose from the ashes of the Black Death. And what do we mean by that term, the Black Death? It was a form of bubonic plague that devastated Europe between 1347 and 1351. During that 4-year span, the Black Death killed approximately half of all Europeans. What do we mean by the term Renaissance? It was a period in Italy from the late 1300s through some point in the 1600s, marking a revival of classical influence, meaning the Greeks and the Romans, focusing on art, literature, and science. These influences eventually spread throughout Europe. Historians divide Western history into 3 major periods: antiquity, the Middle Ages, and modern times. Antiquity covers the beginning of recorded history in the Middle East and Egypt through the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And we always distinguish the Western Roman Empire because the Eastern Roman Empire lasted for another 1,000 years after the fall of the West. We refer to it as the Byzantine Empire, although they called themselves Romans. The Middle Ages occurred after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, when Europe plunged into the Dark Ages. That time period from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 400s up until around the year 1000 was extremely dark. In Western Europe, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, most knowledge of engineering, science, medicine, geography, history, the arts, literature had essentially disappeared. Trade and commerce collapsed. It was an absolutely miserable time to be alive. That period up to around the year 1000 was the early Middle Ages. The late Middle Ages were somewhat better. This brings us to the 3rd period of Western history, modern times, which began with the Renaissance. We use that term because Renaissance means rebirth in French. This was a rebirth of cultural, political, artistic, and economic knowledge. It was a revival of classical Greek and Roman learning. Europeans became interested again in art and philosophy, as well as science, politics, and even exploration. Art was advanced by some of the greatest talents ever known, including Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. During the Renaissance, Europe shifted from feudal systems to city-states and the rise of national monarchies. Although the Renaissance started 50 or more years before Gutenberg invented his printing press, the mass production of books and other texts greatly expanded the reach and advancement of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was no longer restricted to the elite people of Europe. Because of the printing press, it became a widespread cultural revolution. The printing press allowed new translations of important texts from ancient Rome and ancient Greece. This allowed Europeans to build upon the art, literature, science, and politics of those ancient civilizations. During the Renaissance, the printing press allowed for wide distributions of new translations of important ancient medical texts by experts such as the Greek Hippocrates, the ethnically Greek but Roman subject Galen, and Islamic scholars such as Abu Bakr al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes. This greatly increased the advancement of medicine because some of those ancient texts provided understanding about the workings of the human body and methods of diagnosing illnesses that were unknown to European doctors. Europeans can now test some of those medical theories and build upon them. Another result from the printing press was the ability of people to teach themselves. Before books became readily available, you needed somebody to teach you whatever the subject was. Certainly, you could try to discover things on your own, but often that was not practical. But with books, a driven, intelligent person could teach themselves almost anything. The best example is my favorite person in history, Abraham Lincoln. In his entire life, Lincoln had approximately 1 total year of schooling. Think about that. But he was very smart and drove himself to become an educated man. He taught himself grammar and writing, mathematics, science, history, politics, and eventually the law. He became one of the top attorneys of his day. He essentially had no military background when he became the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces during the American Civil War. So he took out many books from the Library of Congress on military strategy, logistics, and tactics. He educated himself to help the Union win the Civil War. Besides all of these scholarly achievements, the printing press was responsible for reading becoming a widespread form of entertainment. Written in the early 1600s, Don Quixote by Cervantes is considered the first modern novel. And as I say this, some of you are thinking, hey, what about ancient writings like the Iliad or the Odyssey or Beowulf? Those are considered epic poems. And anyway, I'm talking about the modern novel. Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe was published in 1719 and is usually credited as the first modern English novel. Before the printing press made books accessible to the average person, most people were illiterate, and so stories were presented as dramas, as plays. Anybody could watch a play and understand it. There was no skill set like reading that was required. Because of the printing press, there were now novels and other books and texts which people could read for enjoyment. Before Gutenberg, other than churches and monasteries, books were limited to the very wealthy because of their expense. By making books cheap to manufacture, books became available to the common person. This access to books meant that common people had access to knowledge. Besides being able to purchase their own books, information for the typical individual greatly increased with the proliferation of libraries. Purportedly, the first library was 2,700 years ago, the Library of Ashurbanipal. There were earlier collections of writings, but supposedly this was the first one that was an actual effort to preserve a wide range of knowledge. The most famous ancient library was the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, built around the early 3rd century BCE. The first public library in Australia opened in 1854 in the city of Victoria. There are disputes as to what constitutes the first public library in the United States. Benjamin Franklin founded a subscription library in Philadelphia in 1731. But it seems that the first true public library was founded in Peterborough, New Hampshire in 1833. And by public library, we're defining this as paid for by municipal dollars and was free of charge to its citizens. One source I found stated that there are over 116,000 libraries in the U.S. That includes public libraries as well as school libraries. Some public libraries have become iconic locations. An example would be the New York City Public Library. You've probably seen it in movies and TV shows with the 2 large lion statues out front. According to the New York Public Library website, those marble lions are named Patience and Fortitude. They have been in front of the New York Public Library, located at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, since the library was dedicated in May 1911. Andrew Carnegie is most famous for creating U.S. Steel, but he was also a huge supporter of public libraries. Carnegie funded over 1,700 libraries in the United States. Of course, in the United States, nothing surpasses the Library of Congress. According to the website of the Library of Congress, today's Library of Congress is an unparalleled world resource. The collection includes millions of catalog books and other print materials in 470 languages, millions of manuscripts, the largest rare book collection in North America, and the world's largest collection of legal materials, films, maps, sheet music, and sound recordings. On August 24, 1814, during the War of 1812, British troops burned the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And no, I did not misspeak about the date. Although it's called the War of 1812, it dragged on through 1814. The Library of Congress was located in the Capitol building at that time. To start a new version of the Library of Congress, Thomas Jefferson offered to sell his enormous personal library of 6,487 books to Congress. And the federal government agreed in 1815. That was the basis for the recreated Library of Congress. I know that many view libraries as very outdated and totally unnecessary with the internet. But for a couple of centuries, libraries granted common people an entrance to more information than the world had ever known. When I was a kid, you went to the library when you had to do a report for school. The same was true when I was in college and had to write a history paper. Libraries were one of the ways a college was measured. Long before I ever got to the University of Notre Dame, they opened the new Memorial Library on campus in 1963. When it opened, the new library at the University of Notre Dame was the largest college library in the United States. It was a point of pride as well as a measurement on the emphasis of academics. Now let's talk about some printed materials which had the biggest impacts on history. This is certainly not a comprehensive list. This is just a sampling of what I think were some of the most influential published texts. Number 1, Common Sense. That was the name of a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine and published in January 1776 in Philadelphia. It was an analysis on systems of government, liberty, and the necessity of American independence. Thomas Paine's biggest critique was that monarchies and hereditary succession were terrible systems of government because they were not based on merit. In its first 3 months of publication, Common Sense sold 120,000 copies. That was a huge number considering there were only about 2.5 million people living in the 13 colonies in 1776. Although the American Revolutionary War had begun in April 1775, in early 1776 there was still a debate whether the 13 colonies should declare independence from Britain. Common sense was one of the primary factors that pushed American colonists from seeking reconciliation with the British Crown to seeking actual independence. Number 2, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe published her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. I read it many years ago and it hit you like a punch in the stomach. It was a novel about enslaved people in the American South before the Civil War. It was a bestseller and had a huge impact. It converted a lot of people into abolitionists. At the time Uncle Tom's Cabin was released, a lot of people in the free states thought that slavery was bad, but it really wasn't their problem. This book really helped change the perception of enslavement. It depicted the horrors of slavery, but even more important, it made white readers think of these oppressed people as individuals like themselves. These were human beings and not just statistics or chattel. Uncle Tom's Cabin was banned in the slave states. During the Civil War, the 6'4" Abraham Lincoln met the approximately 5 feet tall Harriet Beecher Stowe. Supposedly he said to her, "So, you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." We're not sure if he actually said it, but it certainly sounds like something Lincoln would say. Earlier I mentioned Mark Twain. You could visit his house, which is right next to the home of Harriet Beecher Stowe in Hartford, Connecticut. I grew up in Connecticut and visited those houses in the 1980s. They are still open and pretty cool to tour. Okay, back to books that greatly influenced history. Number 3, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. That book was published in 1890 and written by Alfred Thayer Mahan, a United States naval officer and historian. Mahan examined the political and commercial success of nations based upon naval power. He focused on why the island of Britain had such an enormous and powerful empire. His conclusion was that control of the seas through a strong navy and commercial fleet was an important element of national power. Partially because of this book, European countries, the United States, and Japan entered into an arms race to build bigger navies and bigger ships. This was one of the reasons for the naval arms race between Germany and Britain, which was one of the causes leading to World War I. Mahan explained that there were requirements for a navy to have global reach. One of those needs was to have bases around the world to provide the Navy with coal and other supplies. This was one of the reasons why the U.S. acquired territories to serve as such bases like Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. The influence of sea power upon history provided another argument for the need of a canal across Central America, the need for naval mobility, and to secure strategic trade routes. This thinking led to the United States building the Panama Canal in the early part of the 20th century. The U.S. took possession of the canal property and began construction in 1904. The Panama Canal was opened in 1914. Number 4, the Communist Manifesto. Arguably the most influential pamphlet in history, the Communist Manifesto was published in 1848 and authored by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It set out the basic tenets of communism. Its influence was enormous, considering the communist revolutions in Russia in 1917 and later in China, resulting in the proclamation of the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949. Much of the 20th century was defined by animosities between the communist bloc and the capitalist West, including but not limited to the Cold War. Before Gutenberg invented the printing press, news traveled very slowly and not very accurately. In ancient Rome, there were government bulletins called acta diurna. That was Latin for daily doings. Although they might have existed earlier, they became standardized around 59 BCE by Julius Caesar. They were carved into stone or metal and posted in public places for citizens to read. In Europe, in the 1400s and 1500s, most people just lived in their little villages where they were born, and they rarely left. News of even great occurrences did not reach most people. Maybe there was a war, maybe the king died. How were you going to find out about it? News was mostly passed by word of mouth. If a stranger came to town, you might hear about some big event, but was the stranger reliable? This all changed with newspapers. According to the World Association of News Publishers, formerly known as the World Association of Newspapers, the first newspaper in the world was published by Johannes Carolus in 1605 in Strasbourg, Germany. It was a German-language paper whose name I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce. It's considered the first newspaper because it was published on a regular basis, was sold to the public, and covered a variety of topics. The first newspaper in the American colonies was published in Boston in 1690. It was called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. I don't think it counts as the first American newspaper because it only published one issue. The first continuously published newspaper in the American colonies started in 1704, also in Boston. It was called the Boston Newsletter. The first daily newspaper started in 1783. That was the same year when the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the American Revolution. The newspaper was published in Philadelphia and was called the Pennsylvania Evening Post. So many papers throughout the U.S. have gone away, at least in print edition, and you wonder how much longer there will be actual paper editions of any newspapers in this country. The longest continuously printed newspaper in America today is the Hartford Courant, which began in 1764. The New York Post claims to be the nation's oldest continuously published daily newspaper. That was started by Alexander Hamilton on November 16, 1801. I don't know what the paper was like in the 1800s, but for decades now, the New York Post has become a sensationalist tabloid paper. Its most famous headline occurred on April 15, 1983, regarding a decapitated body found in a seedy bar in the New York City borough of Queens. The headline read, "Headless Body in Topless Bar." I have to think Alexander Hamilton was rolling over in his grave with that headline. By the way, it was because of the use of the printing press to make newspapers that we call the news media the press. That's where that term comes from. For anybody under the age of 30, it might be difficult to understand the enormous impact that newspapers once had. In the 1800s, when much of America was still very rural, national editions of New York City newspapers were mailed across the country. That included the New York Herald, the New York Sun, and the New York Weekly Tribune. These newspapers became the first national media in the U.S. At that time, newspapers were the primary way that people got their news. Even once radio and television became popular, newspapers were still very powerful. Here are two famous examples from the 1970s. Number one, the Pentagon Papers. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times began publishing the report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force. Nobody remembers it by its official name. The report came to be known as the Pentagon Papers, and that's what everybody calls it today. What were the Pentagon Papers? In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered an extensive and thorough report of America's involvement in Vietnam. The report, known as the Pentagon Papers, was an enormous description of the history of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. The Pentagon Papers showed that the U.S. government covered up a lot of the true information about the Vietnam War. This report was very unfavorable to U.S. policy and demonstrated that the administration of President Lyndon Johnson had systematically lied not only to the public but also to Congress about the war. The Pentagon Papers had a huge impact on American society by shattering the public trust in the government. Americans used to believe what the president and other government officials told them. That drastically changed and has never been the same since. The Pentagon Papers also drove more people into the anti-war movement. It was one of the factors that led to the end of American involvement in Vietnam just over a year and a half later. Number 2, the Washington Post took down Richard Nixon. You are probably familiar with the Watergate scandal. I did an episode about it with the imaginative title, Watergate. 2 young reporters at the Washington Post named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein might have set the standard for investigative journalism. They kept the Watergate story alive during the summer and fall of 1972. The stories in the Washington Post about the corruption in the administration of President Richard Nixon eventually led to federal prosecutors, a federal grand jury, and congressional investigative committees. The final result was President Nixon giving a nationally televised address on August 8, 1974, announcing that he would resign the presidency at noon the following day, August 9. Besides informing people of the news and conducting investigative journalism, newspapers also helped to spur the growth of the economy. Advertisements in newspapers helped stimulate consumerism. You can look at this as a good thing or a bad thing, but it certainly meant a growth in industrial output and an overall increase in national product. Even though books are being phased out, they still have a lasting legacy. First of all, some people still read paper books. There's something that's just comforting about holding an actual physical book when you are reading it. But more and more people are going to ebooks on their handheld devices or listening to audiobooks. I'm personally a big fan of audiobooks. I like to go to a park or the beach here in Southern California and look at the Pacific and listen to a good history book. Technology today keeps advancing at an amazing pace, but the personal computer, smartphone, and internet have not changed the world as drastically as Gutenberg's printing press. Obviously, the world was much different in the 1980s when I was in law school, and I greatly prefer the technology of today. But the lifestyles of people in the 1980s were not that drastically different than today, at least compared to the extreme changes from the time before Gutenberg invented his printing press system as compared to after the printing press changed the world. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. If you are listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. Spotify does not allow reviews for an entire podcast. However, you can comment and review a particular episode. So, of course, I would appreciate any kind words and a review of this episode on Spotify. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to leave a review for my podcast. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, and then tap Write a Review. Please tell your friends, relatives, or coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for history geeks. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.